Hello, and a very warm welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Lucy Sutton and I'm Vice President of Account Management here at MMS. Today, I'm really excited to be discussing a topic in the regulatory space that I know many of our customers are really keen to hear more about, and that's how AI is being applied to accelerate submission readiness and reduce time to filing. It's my absolute pleasure to discuss today's topic with our subject matter expert for regulatory, Ben Caspar. Welcome, Ben. Really looking forward to chatting today, and I'll hand over to you for a quick introduction.
Thanks, Lucy. Very happy to be here today. I'm Ben Caspar, Vice President of Regulatory Strategy and Regulatory Affairs at MMS. I've been here for 16 years, so I've really seen a lot of changes and developments in the technology and drug development in general. I do try to stay ahead of them, particularly in the field of regulatory strategy and regulatory affairs. So I've been doing a lot of work over the last 2 or 3 years just to get acclimated to these technologies and start to look at them in a more systematic and reproducible way.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ben. Really happy to have you here and looking forward to the topic that we'll discuss today. So just before we jump in and get started, many thanks to those participants who have submitted questions in advance of today's session. You'll notice that you can also submit questions via the chat window here in the live session, and we'd really love to hear what aspects of today's topics are on your mind. So please do submit these as we progress through the discussion. We'll have a little time towards the end of today's session to address a few questions live, and we'll follow up with a written reply to all questions that we don't quite get time to cover. So with that, let's jump into the discussion, and we'll start with a couple of questions, Ben, to sort of really set the scene. So what does AI in clinical research mean to you?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. Yeah, so to me, AI really presents an opportunity to address long-standing challenges with new tools. Um, I think with any transformative technology in drug development, it's really a good practice to revisit ethical imperatives that have been historically challenging, as I think ultimately this is where the largest benefit for these tools will lie. So from my perspective, these imperatives are really sacrificing fewer animals in non-clinical studies. The FDA has been very proactive in this area through their new approach methodologies framework, exposing fewer patients to placebo in clinical trials, enrolling patients who are at more advanced stages of disease, and really improving the informed consent process. But then perhaps most critically, decreasing the time to futility assessment or decision to file for approval. So one of the things I really want to highlight is that the need to build up to these more ambitious goals by applying the technology first in low risk applications. So I think we really, we'll talk about this a little bit today, but we really need to kind of start with discrete sort of low risk applications and then ultimately build up to addressing these more complex imperatives.
Yeah, great. And really good to hear there how you sort of anchored the answer there around the importance of that ethical imperative as the main driver here to really improve and accelerate the process. So thank you for that. Okay, second question. When you talk to sponsors today, what's changed in the last 12 to 18 months, and why does AI feel that little bit more real in the regulatory space now than perhaps it did previously?
Yeah, the technology definitely feels a little bit more mature. The industry's had a few years to adapt to it, and we seem to be in a space now where the models are improving in a slightly more incremental and predictable fashion. I also think the industry as a whole has developed a greater understanding of the differences between, for example, large language models in machine learning and how those tools can be most effectively applied. Um, I think in drug development, there are a lot of questions for which those more traditional machine learning approaches are actually better suited. And there's others where large language models are really game changing. So having a grasp on the types of questions that those different tools apply to is really critical. In terms of LLM specifically, I think they've really improved the ability to do regulatory intelligence, particularly when you use them creatively with machine learning and automation. They aren't necessarily a replacement for regulatory expertise, but they do provide a good second opinion. They're good at doing challenge to precedent exercises. And you can do some pretty rigorous assessments of submission relative to law, guidance, and any number of checklists. So there's a lot of things that you can do in the regulatory space that are low risk, high benefit, and that definitely feels like it's just a regular part of the strategy toolbox now. For example, all the strategists at MMS are pretty familiar with the strengths and limitations of these tools, how to design agents, and things like that. And getting back to that question of machine learning versus LLMs, I think this is a side of things that LLMs are just kind of naturally good at. But again, in the long term, I'm much more interested in building up towards those ethical imperatives that we discussed earlier.
Yeah, yeah. I really love, Ben, how you described there that, AI is part of the regulatory toolbox, and it certainly feels like AI is now having a notable impact, and we're not just talking about it. Things are really starting to change and to happen. Okay, so from the account or delivery side, where are you seeing the strongest pull from clients? Is there speed, consistency, maybe resourcing pressure, or something else?
Yeah, I think from the client side, it's speed, quality, and maybe most critically, managing reviewer burden. So to relate this to the ethical imperatives, I would say that the strongest pull is towards using these tools to speed up the process of preparing an NDA or a BLA. So when you look at programs like the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, those programs put drug development. Let me start that one over. I garbled that a little. Sorry. I think from the client side, it's speed, quality, and maybe most critically managing reviewer burden. So to relate this to the ethical imperatives, I would say the strongest pull is towards using these tools to speed up the process of preparing an NDA or BLA. So programs like the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher, uh, they could put sponsors on a very aggressive rolling review timeline. So there's a lot of interest in using AI tools to manage those timelines, particularly on the medical writing side. And I think this is where it's really important to consider reviewer burden, both on the sponsor side and also on the health authority review side. So what I mean by that is, in general, AI makes it a lot easier to generate initial outputs on the regulatory writing side, but those outputs can really increase reviewer burden without adding much to the overall understanding of the application, particularly if you don't have strong existing medical writing process. So you really need skilled medical writers to use those tools in a way that actually facilitates effective sponsor review and ultimately effective health authority review. In particular, when we're talking about those aggressive rolling review timelines. So that's a big one. I also think in general, sponsors have a lot of concern about data security with these tools and really ensuring their data is not going to be used to train models. So there's a lot of careful control and process that goes into data protection, particularly on the CRO side, just to reassure sponsors that kind of thing isn't going to be an issue.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Really interesting what you described there, and seems even more important to be in step with that rolling review process as you described, and that we're really striving for those fit for purpose solutions whilst kind of maintaining that secure aspect as well. No, great answer there. So what should good AI use mean in regulatory affairs if we're trying to accelerate readiness without sacrificing quality, compliance, or traceability without introducing risk?
Yeah, I think what we're really talking about there is trying to keep our work as reproducible and traceable as possible. And I think that really involves a lot of thorough process and clear documentation. I think what I would suggest to sponsors is that when you start to develop AI tools and process, you almost want to take like a notebook approach to this, meaning you want your protocols to be very well documented, and then you want to think them through carefully before you execute, and then have really strong documentation of results, just like you would do almost in a lab setting. Because just like in a lab setting, that repetition and kind of careful protocol design is really what establishes predictability. And you do that kind of thought process on your kind of low risk use cases, and we'll talk about some of those as we go on. And then you're kind of deriving benefit from being able to use those tools within those specific use cases, but you're also developing the kind of muscle memory and process design that you can then use to build some of those more advanced use cases that really start to address those ethical imperatives.
Yeah, and that really sounds like a very sort of responsible approach there, Ben. Just kind of that stepwise approach, like you say, looking at those low risk use cases first and establishing the consistency and the predictability in that space initially. So great answer. Okay, what are the top 2 to 3 workflow points where AI is delivering the most immediate impact right now for submission readiness? So, for example, earlier readiness signals, fewer cycles, faster assembly.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we talk about submission readiness and really submission quality overall, the immediate technical impact is the ability to do certain critical checks on a rolling basis, rather than at the end of the submission process, as has been traditionally the case. So my background is actually in medical writing, and often when I've worked on major submissions in the past, completion of documents like the clinical overview, the label, the reviewer's guide, those really tend to come down to the wire, which can be a problem because those documents, particularly the label, need to build very precisely on the internal consistency of the submission as a whole. And that internal consistency ultimately plays a major role in reducing information requests during the review period, which again, if we, relating this back to like, some of these accelerated review programs or these rolling review programs that we've talked about, that could be a delay if there are issues with internal consistency. So you don't want to wait until the end to do those kinds of checks. And there's a number of AI tools you can build that allow you to do those kinds of consistency checks across documents, in a more iterative fashion as the documents are written or earlier in the draft cycle. So when you have your submission review meetings with the whole team, for example, you're not just checking document status, but you're also flagging and resolving those consistency issues early in the draft cycle. So it's a much more effective use of time. And you can take that same approach to things like refusal to file mitigation by automating a submission check against, for example, FDA filing checklists, which those are publicly available. The FDA has released those. So all of those real-time approaches to submission building are high confidence in my mind, particularly if you're sort of retaining the traditional refusal to file and consistency checks that are part of your standard process at the end. So what you'll end up with is just a lot less rework through those kind of early checks. You'll avoid those situations where you have to push a submission out a week or two to make a couple of documents consistent because you didn't do that check till the very end of the process. So it's a good way to build quality submissions and save time.
Yeah, I really like how you've described that there, Ben, and clear advantages, I think, for time management for the team, which seems a huge advantage, and really that process of being able to better address and resolve issues as they arise rather than sort of end loading towards the end of the process. So really great insights there. Okay, can you share an example of high confidence use case? So something you'd be very comfortable scaling because the risk profile is manageable with the right oversight.
Sure. I think in terms of high confidence use cases, pretty much everything in the regulatory intelligence gathering space is high confidence. What I personally love about some of these tools as a strategist is they just give me the ability to think outside of my immediate experience of regulatory precedent. So, like being a strategist, your experience tends to be shaped by the limited set of projects you've worked on, the review divisions you've communicated with, et cetera. But that's inherently going to be a narrow and somewhat limited view of things. So I think it's just another voice that helps to achieve a slightly better consensus than any individual strategist might be able to come up with on their own.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really great way of thinking about it there, Ben. How you describe AI as that strategy tool, which really just augments your own expertise and experience and ability to even more thoroughly challenge an approach than you would normally without that support. Okay, if a sponsor's starting from scratch, what adoption framework would you put into place before scaling AI across regulatory affairs?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. I think in general, the amount of autonomy we allow for AI tools within regulatory affairs really needs to have a reverse correlation with the overall risk of the application. And then, within that kind of planning framework, you have to think very carefully about how all of those risks are going to be mitigated. Um, so when we talk about things like high-level literature summarization, in general regulatory intelligence gathering, these are relatively low risk, and they tend to lend themselves to a little bit higher degree of automation, particularly if the deliverables that come out of that work are ultimately created with significant human involvement. So again, those are the types of processes where you really want to start to build some strong agents that are reproducible, traceable, and thorough. Because risk mitigation at that step can really just come from experts who can systematically assess the quality of those outputs. At the next level, you start to get into like the high level medical writing applications. For example, drafting summary language or basic draft one text. So there, medical writing oversight becomes particularly important. Like we talked about, just to ensure accuracy and also to make sure that the reviewers aren't unnecessarily burdened with things that are unfocused or maybe tangential to sort of the message of the submission overall. So that's kind of the second level of sort of risk versus automation. And then you get to the next level, which would be like actual interpretation of data, making strategy recommendations and things like that. And I think there, the approach to de-risking those tools is relatively straightforward. You think about their outputs as essentially advisory or more of a second opinion capacity for those types of applications.
Yeah, yeah, great, great. Okay, that does bring us to the questions from the audience. I think we've got enough time to maybe take one or two questions, which is great. So maybe let's start with one here that we hear a lot from teams that are maybe beginning to explore AI in the regulatory space. So great question here. What's the lowest risk starting point for AI in reg affairs? Where can you prove value quickly without creating compliance headaches?
Yeah. Yeah. From my perspective, it's really the use cases we've discussed during this talk. High level, real time regulatory intelligence gathering, agentic monitoring of clinical trial registries, based on things like mechanism of action. And then all those real time checks we discussed, particularly when you backstop them with sort of those traditional review processes prior to a filing actually being submitted.
Perfect. All right, so one last question, quite a broad question here for you, Ben, but I'm sure the audience will be really wanting to know your thoughts on this. So looking ahead, how do you see AI progressing in regulatory affairs?
Yeah, yeah, great question. I think we're going to continue to see this shift from sort of traditional milestone-based approaches to drug development to a more real-time based approach, not only during clinical development, but also with the application prep stage, the review stage on the FDA side, on other health authorities' sides, and also in the post-marketing environment. So, I think there's really three areas that are noteworthy in this regard, like right now, that sponsors can think about. The first, the FDA recently released a request for information on AI-enabled optimization of early phase clinical trials. So they're pretty serious about taking steps to improve real-time decision making during early development. The comment period for that RFI actually closes on May 29th. So I definitely recommend sponsors take a look at that. The questions in that RFI are really thought-provoking, and they're also a good focusing tool just in terms of, you know, the questions that sponsors might want to address in terms of getting to some tangible and practical ways of doing this, taking this real-time approach to early stage clinical trials. So that's really good stuff. Second, I think when it comes to NDA and BLA prep, like by necessity, we're going to see a lot of progression in AI tools that facilitate consistency in filing checks. The kinds of things I mentioned earlier, particularly when we talk about these high pressure rolling review situations, like real-time oncology review. That's kind of the classic example of this. But also the commissioner's national priority voucher, which I think on the sponsor side is in a lot of ways shaping up to have some of the same challenges that are inherent in real-time oncology review. So I think, in those kind of high pressure cases, if those tools prove to be reproducible and traceable, we're going to see much broader implementations. So those are definitely the areas to keep an eye on as a sponsor in terms of how these tools are going to be proactively applied.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Ben. Amazing to hear your perspectives there on the sort of go forward picture, and really great advice and recommendations for our sponsors in that answer as well. Thank you. So a massive thank you overall for your insights and expert viewpoints today. It's really been a pleasure. I think we can all agree this is a very fast moving topic, but one in which the application of AI in the regulatory space brings clear advantages to accelerate clinical research. A massive thank you to everyone who's joined us live today. We really look forward to addressing the questions that we couldn't quite get to in follow-up. You will see on the screen just now a few ways in which you can easily contact us to discuss today's topic a little bit further. So please do feel free to reach out via LinkedIn or via our website at the links that are shown just here. So with that, wishing everyone a really pleasant rest of the day, and we look forward to speaking again very soon.